on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote for the ayes and nays are ordered. I would like to remind members that we've established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating amendments, exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our markup today. If you'd like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as possible. I would also ask all members, both those in person and those appearing remotely, to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. Since this will likely be our final markup of the year, before I call up the first bill, I want to thank all the members on both sides of the aisle for what has been another exceptionally busy and productive year on the Judiciary Committee. Throughout the 117th Congress, we have held 76 hearings, with one more scheduled for tomorrow. We have marked up nearly 100 bills in the committee, and we have passed almost 100 bills on the House floor. Of these bills, we have sent 24 to President Biden for his signature, with at least 4 more likely headed his way shortly. Although we have certainly had spirited debates on a number of topics, we have also worked together in a bipartisan fashion on many issues. This includes legislation to combat human trafficking, to curtail excessive government surveillance and data collection, to make lynching a federal crime at long last, to require greater judicial transparency, and to end forced arbitration in sexual harassment and sexual assault cases. None of this would have happened without the hard work of our members and staff, and we should all be proud of what this committee has accomplished. As we conclude our work for the year, we must also say farewell to a number of our members who will not be returning to Congress in the new year. Each one has served the committee and this institution with great distinction, and we will miss them greatly. This includes our former colleague, Ted Deutsch, who recently departed the House to lead one of the most respected Jewish organizations, the American Jewish Congress. Congressman Deutsch was a leader on many issues, including intellectual property, and he was especially passionate about gun safety issues, having represented the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Another senior member who will be departing is Karen Bass, former chair of the Crime Subcommittee and the sponsor of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, among other important bills, including 2 that passed the House just last week. We will miss her voice on criminal justice and other issues, but we are excited to see her take on a groundbreaking new challenge as mayor of Los Angeles. We will also miss Val Demings and the passion and grace that she brought to our hearing room. In particular, we appreciate how her considerable and valuable experience in law enforcement shaped our debates on criminal justice and public safety issues. Finally, we bid farewell to Mondaire Jones. Although he is one of our most junior members, he hit the ground running as a forceful advocate for judicial reform, among other issues, and he provided an important voice to our discussions. In addition to these Democratic members, we will also miss 2 senior members on the Republican side. I will let the ranking member talk about them further, but we will miss Steve Shabbat, with whom I partnered for many years atop the Constitution Subcommittee, and Louis Gohmert, whose experience as a former judge brought a unique perspective to our debates. I thank all members of the committee for their contributions to this Congress, and I am now pleased to recognize a gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to thank Mr. Deutsch, Mr. Jones, and Ms. Bass and Ms. Demings for their work on the committee and wish them nothing but the best in their new endeavors. And then, of course, on our side, we have Steve Shabbat, a great member who's been on this committee, I think, all the time in Congress, 26 years, I believe, and a fellow Ohioan, and been a strong champion for defending the sanctity of human life, was the lead sponsor on a number of key pieces of legislation that have been signed into law. We're all going to miss Steve. And then, of course, Mr. Gohmert, Judge Gohmert, who, I mean, we're going to miss Louis, sweet Lou Gohmert. I saw he just walked in, but we're going to miss his wit, his humor, and his ability to go from 0 to 60 in about 2 seconds when he's making comments and going after a witness. So we appreciate both of these distinguished members and wish them nothing but the best as well in their life after Congress. And with that, I yield back.
Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3861, the Preventing Suicide Through Voluntary... What? Did I say that? Let's start that again. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 8361. I thought I got it right the first time. The Preventing Suicide Through Voluntary Firearm Purchase Delay Act, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 8361, to help prevent suicide by giving people more control over their own lethal means.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 8361, the Preventing Suicide Through Voluntary Firearm Purchase Delay Act, would save lives by establishing a national suicide prevention database connected with the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS, to which anyone who is concerned that he or she is at risk of committing suicide and who wishes to be unable to purchase a firearm could add his or her name on a strictly voluntary basis. This bipartisan legislation, introduced by Congresswoman Jayapal and co-sponsored by Congressman Curtis, Congressman Buck, and Congressman Krishnamurthy, is modeled after successful efforts in Washington, Utah, and Virginia. Under the bill, if someone attempts to purchase a firearm while their name is on the voluntary database, a NICS background check would result in a denial, meaning that they would be unable to purchase a firearm. The bill also gives individuals the opportunity to provide the email addresses of friends or family who would be notified if they attempted to purchase a firearm, in the hopes that these friends and families might realize a loved one is experiencing a crisis and can get them whatever help they may need. The bill includes numerous safeguards to ensure that it operates as intended. For example, it allows individuals to remove their name from the database in as little as 24 hours. It protects users' privacy by directing the Attorney General to prevent unauthorized disclosure of names in the database, and by ensuring that a seller is not made aware of the reasons for a NICS denial arising from a database listing. The bill also strictly limits the use of the database. For example, listing one's name in the database cannot be used to determine employment eligibility or as legal evidence. Finally, the legislation includes an outreach and education provision to reach those who might benefit most from this database. It directs the Attorney General to educate the public about the database through consultation with the CDC, the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and the Indian Health Services. The amendment in the nature of a substitute that we will consider shortly adds the Department of Veterans Affairs to this list of collaborators. This joint effort to reach those who are at a heightened risk of suicide, including Native Americans and our veterans, would help ensure that anyone who is in crisis and who thinks they should not be in possession of a firearm will have access to the voluntary life-saving tool established under the bill. I thank Congresswoman Jayapal for her efforts in introducing this bipartisan legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do we really need a federal statute to permit a person to volunteer to give up their fundamental liberty? That's what this bill does. This bill requires the Attorney General to establish and maintain a federal database for Americans who voluntarily want to give up their Second Amendment right. Mental health is important. We all understand that, especially as it relates to suicide. But this, I mean, really, this is what we're going to do? Even assuming that this bill is well-intentioned, it still contains many flaws, and it could have unintended consequences. We haven't had a hearing to discuss those consequences. Under one section of this bill, for example, the Attorney General has broad discretion to establish how American citizens can have their name removed from the database that they voluntarily asked to put on. I mean, we know that's going to be tough. We have had debate on the whole red flag concept, something that just, I think, is so dangerous. We've had debate on that and how hard it would be to get off of that list, let alone this one. If a citizen wants to have their name removed from the database, they must either wait 21 days or choose to submit to the whims of the Attorney General in order to have his or her name removed within a 24-hour time frame. You can be assured that getting your name removed from the database will be as difficult as possible and will be a deterrent for anyone to put their name on the list to begin with, assuming that this thing is going to work. Furthermore, people are inevitably going to be pressured by family members, mental health professionals, law enforcement, and others to put their names into the database. There should be penalties for law enforcement, mental health professionals who use undue pressure to coerce American citizens to surrender their constitutional liberties. No such provisions are currently included in the bill. This bill, I believe, is a rushed attempt to institute a national database. Only 3 states have done it, and the data that we have from these states suggests that only a very small number of individuals have even elected to participate in the program. I think this, again, is just another attack from the Democrats on the Second Amendment, and oppose the legislation. Would yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I recognize myself to explain the amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes primarily technical and conforming changes. It also adds the Department of Veterans Affairs to the outreach and education provision and modifies the expedited withdrawal process to incorporate input from the American Psychological Association. I urge all members to support the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Ms. Jayapal seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very proud that we're marking up my bipartisan bill with Representative John Curtis from Utah today, the Preventing Suicide Through Voluntary Firearm Purchase Delay Act. Today, we face a dire mental health emergency of death by suicide. In 2021, 26,000 Americans committed suicide using a gun. That's 72 lives per day that were lost to suicide with a firearm. My bill would create a new tool that gives people experiencing the challenging swings of mental health illness to have the power to proactively and voluntarily protect themselves by putting themselves on a do not sell list for a firearm. Jack is one of the people who compelled me to address this issue. Jack is a PhD student at the University of California, Los Angeles, who wrote to me, "I have tasted the barrel of a gun before." Jack described his mental health crises that led him to being within seconds of pulling the trigger multiple times. Had he pulled the trigger, Jack would almost certainly not be alive today, because firearms are by far the most lethal means of suicide. 90% of attempted suicides with guns result in death, whereas other lethal means are fatal in only 4% of attempts. Suicides account for 56% of all gun deaths in the United States. So decreasing gun suicides can make huge progress in lowering the number of Americans we lose each year to gun deaths. Another incredible advocate that I met shared the story of her mother, Donna, who struggled with bipolar disorder. Donna and her family fought hard to get her treatment and protect her from harming herself. Unfortunately, they didn't have all the tools that they needed. And one day, Donna abruptly purchased a gun and killed herself. Donna's daughter, Katrina, believes that if my bill were enacted into law, it would have saved her mother. And Jack believes that this bill will exponentially increase his ability to live. This bill creates a bipartisan, proven mechanism to save lives like Jack's. It creates a novel way for individuals to voluntarily enroll in a firearm purchase delay database that temporarily prevents their ability to buy a firearm. Once enrolled, if a person experiences a mental health crisis and attempts to buy a firearm, they will be unable to. And in cases where an individual tries to purchase a gun to attempt suicide, this will be life-saving. In a University of Alabama study conducted by Professor Frederick Vars, researchers found that 46% of patients at high risk of suicide at the medical center would enroll in this system if available. Based on that data, this bill could save over 12,000 American lives per year. The bill is completely voluntary. Individuals cannot be enrolled by anyone other than themselves, and enrollment in the database is confidential, and information on enrollees cannot be used for any purpose other than to determine firearm purchasing eligibility, with very strict penalties for misuse and unapproved access of information. And if someone wants to remove themselves from the database, they can do so with no limits on the number of times they enroll and disenroll. It is modeled after similar bills that have already passed in my home state of Washington and in Utah with broad bipartisan support. Broad bipartisan support. In Utah, 2 Republican state legislators championed the bill, and support spans from mental health groups to gun rights groups. When the Utah bill passed, the chairman of the Utah Sports Shooting Council said, quote, "We support this legislation at the Utah Shooting Sports Council because it is completely voluntary, self-revocable, private, and confidential." So as we discuss this bill today, I urge my colleagues to think about what this bill will mean to the people facing mental health crises, whose lives could be saved, and what this bill means to their loved ones. I have seen firsthand the trauma that suicide causes, not only for the one whose life is lost, but for all the loved ones who remain. My husband lost his father to suicide when Steve was just 6 years old. We need more tools to help those who are fighting mental health illness. And let me be clear, this is a suicide prevention bill, one that has been used in red states and blue states to save lives. I want to thank the families and individuals who have shared what this bill means for them, including some of my own constituents who have lost family members to gun suicides. Matt and Cara. And I also want to thank Professor Vars, who was essential to drafting this bill. For these families and so many more that need tools to prevent suicides, I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
This is one of those pieces of legislation that sounds good and it feels good, but it doesn't work, and it opens Pandora's box. I think it's a wild exaggeration to say it would save 12,000 American lives per year. That assumes the person doesn't already own a gun or that a relative doesn't have a gun. And it also leaves out a very unfortunate phenomenon that I'm aware of because I have a friend who owns a gun store. People who want to commit suicide don't need to buy the gun. They can go rent it. There are ranges where you can rent a firearm, and you don't have to purchase it. Now, this has happened at gun ranges, and it would happen with more frequency, I would expect, if somebody puts themselves on a database, which I don't think that's going to work either, but it just happens, and you're ignoring that this bill doesn't address that, can't address that. One of the things, my biggest concern isn't just that the bill doesn't work, isn't going to work, and doesn't understand how these suicides occur. It's that it's ripe for abuse. I see here in the bill there's a provision where you can add your name by mail or by electronic mail. If somebody wants to dox you, I mean, this is a fairly recent phenomenon of the internet age, but you upset some folks on the internet and they will go to great lengths to get you fired, to get you in trouble. I can imagine that they would attempt to submit your name by mail, steal your identity, and thereby deprive you of your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And if they can intercept the communication that comes back the other way to confirm that you've been added to this list, you won't even know that you're on the list. So that's a big concern of mine. It also says that you can do this by mail if there's a letter accompanied by a mental health professional. What I'm concerned about is this creates a database. This opens the door, and write this down, mark it down, come back in 10 years and see if they haven't tried this, to allow this very system that this bill would set up to be accessed not by individuals with a letter from a mental health professional, but simply with a letter from a mental health professional. This is going to be ripe for expansion to do that. And I'm afraid this is one of those predictions that unfortunately is going to come true, that they're going to expand this later, and it's not just going to be the individual that submits their name. And I know there's a provision in here that says you can't be required to submit your name as condition of employment or to receive any benefit or service, but that's going to happen. It happens today at the Veterans Administration. I've had whistleblowers who work for the Veterans Administration tell me that what happens is when a veteran goes from like 50% disability and they apply for about maybe 85 or 90% disability, there's an interview that happens, and a doctor asks, or somebody at the VA asks, do you handle your own finances? And if you are unfortunate enough to say that you don't handle your own finances, and for some of these cases, people are thinking, well, my wife has the checkbook. I've never even written a check, so I don't. Mr. Tiffany would associate with that remark. I would too. I don't really manage my own finances. So if you say that, here's what happens. They add you into this Brady criteria. You get put in the NICS database. You become federally prohibited from owning a firearm. There's no adjudication. There's the opportunity for adjudication, but here's how it happens. In the same envelope that the VA sends you that says, we approved your benefits, there's another letter that says, by the way, unless you appeal, you're going into the NICS background check system. No veteran who depends on that benefit to stay in their home, to buy their food, is going to appeal that when it comes in the same envelope. So that's another grave concern I have about this legislation, is that there will be the implied condition that you submit your name before you receive something from somebody else. And it may be a family member. It could be a family member who just says, look, I'd like to give you this or get you that, but you're going to have to put your name in this database. And so it's for that and other reasons I oppose this bill, and I will have some amendments on this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back for our purposes. Gentleman from Rhode Island, seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, for bringing this suicide prevention bill to markup today. We have a mental health crisis in this country, and we're losing far too many Americans to suicide. And half of these suicides are committed with a firearm, leading to 24,000 deaths each year. The odds of a suicide attempt ending in death are 140 times higher when a gun is involved. A 2020 Stanford Medical School study found that men who own a gun are 8 times more likely to die of a gun-related suicide than those who don't have a firearm. With women, they are 35 times more likely to die of a gun-related suicide than those who don't have a firearm. These are alarming and important statistics, and we can do something about it. We need to acknowledge and act on the link between firearms and suicides. This bill does that and takes a step toward helping people, allowing someone who knows that they're struggling with their mental health to voluntarily enroll themselves onto a do not sell list, preventing them from purchasing a gun until they remove themselves from the list. This really sensible bipartisan bill is a smart solution that puts no onus on anyone. It simply allows someone to make a decision for themselves to protect their own life. Sadly, we all have constituents or family members or friends who have lost a loved one by suicide using a firearm. This legislation allows us to do something about it. And you know, some people say, well, the figure that the sponsor, Congresswoman Jayapal, mentioned was too high a number. I'm from a religious tradition that if we save one life by this passage of this bill, we've saved everyone. And so to the families and loved ones who have had to deal with the unbearable pain of losing a loved one to suicide by using a firearm, this is a welcome action that hopefully can prevent others from confronting the same heartbreak. So I want to thank Congresswoman Jayapal for her thoughtful leadership on this bill. It will help reduce the number of people that we are tragically losing to suicide every single day in this country. I support this legislation strongly and urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back who seeks recognition. Gentleman from Kentucky.
I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment. Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8361 offered by Mr. Massey of Kentucky. Page 9, after line 24, insert the following. Section 6, criminal penalties for
Amendment will be
coercing.
considered as read. The gentleman has 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank the chairman for allowing me to offer this amendment. This addresses one of the concerns I have. This basically says that there's a criminal penalty for somebody who coerces an individual to add their name to the voluntary purchase delay database. Obviously, it's not voluntary if you've been coerced, and this is a legitimate concern. Somebody on the other side of the aisle just said, if this bill saves just one life, it's worth passing. Well, if this bill costs one life, it's worth stopping. Somebody in an abusive relationship could be forced to submit their name to this list, and then the abuser knows that that person has no means to acquire a firearm for self-defense. And so that's just one of the dozens of permutations of ways this legislation could turn out bad and cost lives. So this amendment would set up a criminal penalty for coercing individuals to add his or her name to the voluntary.
Gentleman
database.
yields.
I will yield to the ranking member.
So you made me think of something. Or maybe someone said this to me yesterday as we were talking about this bill. Let's just say a lady in an abusive relationship, she may actually have some mental concerns at that time, and she may actually support this. But once the husband's gone or the boyfriend or what's gone, the ability to then get back off the list and all the problems, that could be a situation where this bill, I think, would be problematic for that particular person as well. Would you agree?
I would agree, and I'm going to have another amendment to try and address this situation as well. And I thank the gentleman for his point. You know, later today, we're going to be debating a resolution of inquiry about these documents that the FBI agents presented to people, at least 15 individuals, where between 2016 and 2019 received documents called NICS Indices Self-Submission Form. And if you signed this form, it resulted in the denial of your right to purchase or possess a firearm. And the question is, were these forms presented under duress? Did somebody at the FBI say, you sign this form or I'm going to arrest you? You sign this form or I'm going to investigate you? This isn't a hypothetical. This is the subject of something later today, one of the ROIs that we're going to debate, HRES 1477, a concern that we have that people under threat, under duress, were forced to put their name on a list that says they can't buy a gun. So this amendment is simple. I would hope we get support from the other side of the aisle on this, that there should be, and I don't like adding criminal penalties to the federal code, but this is one of those places where it's called for. If you're going to have this bill, I don't support the underlying bill at all, but if you're going to have this bill, at least don't create the situation where people can be coerced into adding their name to the database and become deprived of their Second Amendment. I'll yield to the gentleman from North Carolina.
I just have a question. I noticed that the amendment would address efforts to use force or threat of force to induce an individual to add their name to the database, but even this wouldn't extend to someone who might use undue influence. Isn't that correct?
That's absolutely correct. My amendment doesn't go far enough in preventing this. It's a very modest proposal. It only covers a subset of my concerns, and that's why I hope the other side
Would the gentleman yield?
I thank the gentleman.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield to the chairman.
Thank you. Does the gentleman insist on his point of order?
I do not, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order is reserved, and we are prepared to accept the amendment. Oh.
I was just going to
Mr.
speak
Diapol?
to it, yeah.
I'm sorry, Ms. Diapol is
All
ready.
right, well,
Thank you.
wait a minute, just a second.
Yeah, Mr.
Does
Massey.
anybody else on our side want any time? I will yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Representative Massey for this amendment. I don't see a problem with this amendment because I think this would be a problem if this happened. And I hope, Mr. Massey, that in taking this amendment, that you will vote for the bill. It's a bipartisan bill. I know that there's a real desire on this committee to offer amendments and then assume that the other side's not going to take it. But we're working on a bill that is actually substantive policy and good bipartisan policy. And so I hope that you will enter this into the same spirit that I do on behalf of our constituents across the country who lose families to gun suicides. I think this is a fine amendment. The one friendly amendment I might ask you if you want to make is in line 7, just to say, so it would read, whoever by force or threat of force induces an individual to add the name of the individual who is otherwise authorized to possess a firearm, because I think we are assuming that this person would be authorized to possess a firearm. But I'm fine with this amendment with that line, small line change.
I'm fine with that.
This is beautiful to watch, this bipartisan.
It's so beautiful to watch, Representative
Let's model
Massey.
this behavior.
And I can't wait to get you on this bill, because really, let me just say, because I think it's still my time, let me just say, look, we do try to legislate here with people who want to legislate and people who want to help save lives. And I take it in the spirit that's the way it was offered, Mr. Massey, and I appreciate your amendment.
So with that, I'll call for a vote on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Oh. Do we do that by unanimous consent? We did, yes. I'll ask unanimous consent to amend the amendment as was specified a moment ago.
Yes, well, I have opportunity to speak.
On that,
Yes.
gentleman is recognized.
And I'll be brief. I thank the gentlelady for agreeing that I have improved this bill, but I regret to say I haven't improved it enough.
What a surprise, Mr. Massey.
With that,
What a shocker.
I will yield back.
All right.
And I do not object.
So without objection, the amendment is amended. All in favor of the amendment as amended will say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment as amendment is adopted. Who else seeks recognition on this bill? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Look, we know that suicide attempts with firearms are far more fatal than attempts by any other means.
Talk closer to the mic.
Sorry. There we go. We know that suicide attempts with firearms are far more fatal than attempts by any other means. And according to recent data from the Giffords Law Center, about 63% of gun deaths in Pennsylvania are suicides, and approximately half of all suicide deaths in our Commonwealth involve firearms. Clearly, easy access to guns can be a determining factor in whether an at-risk person dies by their own hand. And suicide by gun is a particular issue for our veterans, where the combination of trauma and access to firearms is particularly deadly. So allowing people to voluntarily enroll themselves onto a do not sell list for firearms will go a long way towards helping individuals keep themselves, their loved ones, and their communities safe, should they be a danger to themselves or others due to mental health issues. In so many cases, suicide is preventable, and when people have the opportunity to get the help that they need to keep themselves from harm, the results can be life-saving. In states where laws like this have already been enacted, we've seen suicide prevention databases protect those who've enrolled themselves. And it's time we create a federal tool like this to help prevent suicide nationwide. I thank Congresswoman Jayapal for introducing this important bipartisan legislation, and to everyone who's worked in good faith to promote it. I look forward to passing this bill out of committee and urge all of my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I am moved by the number of suicides we have in this country. The extent to which any weapon would be involved in that is terrifying and awful, and we should do a lot to try to prevent those suicides. But I guess what I'm wondering is, who exactly is this particular bill going to save? Because I can't imagine the circumstance where someone is at the end, at the bottom, believing that they had no choice but to take their own life. And the final thing that they thought that they needed to do was to go and fill out some government paperwork to put themselves onto a government database.
Would the gentleman yield?
Well, in just a moment, because I've observed, so as I was wondering who would really do this, and to what extent would that reduce the tens of thousands of suicides that we would certainly want to prevent. I did observe what had happened in the states that had passed these laws. And in Utah, I believe 5 people have enrolled. And in Washington State, though the gentlelady may correct me, I believe it's 13. So while tens of thousands of people die of suicide, there aren't yet tens of people in these 2 states that have self-enrolled in these programs. And so I think Mr. Massey's point, if there were to be any mistake, any circumstance where someone was then deprived of the ability to defend themselves, I could certainly see that being just as likely as this sort of virtue signal of a piece of legislation actually resulting in that outcome. I'd yield to the gentlelady.
Thank you. Representative Gates, the answer to your question is you actually enroll in the program at any time, not when you're in the depths of your last sort of throes and you're contemplating suicide in that moment. But people who have mental health illness have enrolled in the program, and it has then saved their life at the time when they are having tremendous swings or challenges and they suddenly seek the gun. And so that's what Katrina's mom would have done.
Is my data correct? In Washington State, is it only 13 people?
It's 25 in Washington, and the programs are brand new. But I guess I would ask you, Mr. Gates, how many people do you think it's worth saving? I mean, do you think one life is worth saving? Do you think 13 are, 25? Does it have to be 8,000 to be worthwhile?
I would suggest that the risk has to be balanced against the risk that somebody could be in a worse situation regarding their own safety. And, the notion that we sort of begin these debates with a pronouncement of the tens of thousands of people that we're going to save, and then I'm not entirely sure that the 25 people in Washington State were saved. I mean, I'm also trying to envision the circumstance you described where someone thinks, well, I might one day get to a point where I would engage in self-harm, and the thing that I'm going to do between now and that moment is to go and enroll myself in a government database and to fill out government paperwork. That just does not connect to me. It would seem more likely to me that these 25 people who did this sort of did it as a form of self-therapy, and there would be a lot of other ways to do that without expanding government databases that give a lot of us.
Mr. Gates, will you yield for?
Sure.
So I think the example,
It's her time.
I think it is not uncommon for people who might be struggling with substance abuse or some other addiction or other mental health challenges to have moments in which they recognize that they are in a difficult space. And in that moment, they have control over where that firearm is, but they recognize that things are getting worse for them, and they need a safe place to put that firearm. And it's, mental health is not linear. People have good and bad days, challenging moments, times of losses. So this would allow people just to have their own.
Why wouldn't they just lock it up or get rid of it or don't go buy the gun?
Because they may get access to it. They may think the safest way is to be sure that it's out of their possession. And why not give them that tool to help save their lives?
I guess I don't believe that the people that would be susceptible to that ultimate outcome would be the people filling out government paperwork to deprive themselves of their own rights. I mean, Mr.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sir.
I would point out that your problem, Mr. Yates, is that you are completely sane.
Well,
Not everybody.
I'm rarely accused.
Not everybody is all the time, and this bill is intended to help people who may not be all the time.
Yeah, I would
Would the
suggest
gentleman
that the path to sanity and the path to better mental health rarely goes through filling out more government paperwork and enrolling yourself
Would the gentleman
on
yield?
a government database. I will yield.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that the University of Alabama has a letter that I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record, and it is specifically looking at when a program like this is used, and it did a significant amount of research, and it looked and said that this is a program that, based on this data that they have, of 46% of patients at high risk of suicide at the University of Alabama Medical Center who would enroll in the system if available, it would save about 12,000 American lives every year.
Yeah, I would likely question that, but I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
And actually, I think I just want to ask a question of Ms. Jayapal if she'll answer it. And so I'd offer to yield to answer this. You said, I think that Washington's done this, Utah's done it. Why can't it be left to states to decide whether to do it?
Yeah, this was something that we talked about again and again. You know, we are constantly looking for opportunities to take proven programs in other states that work. And when Representative Curtis and I started talking about this, what we realized is that this is something that really should be expanded across the country because so many states don't have this right now. This is a voluntary program. You can get into it and out of it as quickly as possible. And so I think that it wasn't an easy road to implementation in these states because we had to take each one at a time because the burden of setting up the brand new infrastructure to support this type of system. And I think that I've heard from other states that have not been able to make progress yet that this would really help them to be able to quickly institute it in their states and get it going and help save lives immediately.
Yeah, just to follow that up, I mean, if they've run into problems in their states doing it, it might also be some people have some of the opposition or reasons for concern that Mr. Massey said. So why make that choice for the citizens of Kentucky? Why not leave it to the citizens of Kentucky through their legislators to decide whether it's a wise choice or not?
I'm happy to give you my answer to that if you're asking.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, look, it would be like reinventing the wheel 50 times. We are constantly looking for programs that are proven and successful. And often on this committee, when we talk about things, you say, oh, you know, it's not proven. Well, here's one that is proven, not just in a blue state, but in a red state, endorsed by the Shooting Council, endorsed by Republican legislators. Why can't we do it here? Why can't we implement this here and help cut through a lot of that implementation process issues that states have just because there's a lot on their table when we know that there's something that works?
I thank the gentlelady. And I guess, I know your question was posed rhetorically, but I'll take up to try to answer it. It seems to me that that's exactly why we have this, what is it, what is the justice referred to it as? The experiment or the laboratory of democracy, the several states who get to make different policy decisions based on the predilections and views of their own citizens. And I don't know that every time you come up with something that, in fact, if something is a good model and works well and the idea sells itself, it will be emulated in other states. And it seems, I'm very troubled that we would enact a provision that has the federal government. I'm trying to think what part of the federal government's enumerated responsibilities it falls under to invite citizens to surrender their constitutional rights. I knew that we do it. I was thinking through that. We do it it's interesting to me. I was thinking through Miranda versus Arizona. We do allow people to surrender their constitutional rights as criminally accused or being investigated. But we, you know, over time, the Supreme Court has said that's something that ought to be done very cautiously. And consequently, the Supreme Court imposed on law enforcement across the country the responsibility to give warnings designed to ensure that the person involved was not doing that.
Would the gentleman yield?
Mr. Bishop, I'm happy to answer your question if you'll yield.
Well, let me see. I got about 5 requests, and I think just for the time being available to keep it balanced, I heard Mr. Gates behind me, so I'll yield to him first.
Just briefly, Mr. Bishop, is perhaps one of the reasons why other states may not have copied this program is that there are more states than there are human beings that have ever enrolled in one of these programs. Would that perhaps be a demonstrative of efficacy?
I think you make a point, Mr. Gates, and I would. Did you ask me, Mr. Massey? I yield to Mr.
Well, to your point, Mr. Bishop, now that I look at this, I'm concerned about the constitutionality of this and whether it would withstand a challenge in the Supreme Court if somebody couldn't get their gun after their name had entered onto this database, because the Gun-Free School Zone Act was struck down by the Supreme Court because there was no interstate nexus. And so Congress passed it again and said only for guns that have traveled in interstate commerce. So without that phrase in here, I'm afraid it is on its face unconstitutional.
I would be thrilled to continue yielding, but my time has been exhausted.
Time has indeed been exhausted. Who else seeks recognition? For what purpose, the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Strike the last word,
Gentleman is recognized.
right? This is a very serious subject, and suicides have become just a tremendous pandemic, if we use that word too often, but it's tragic. And all too often, we want to look at well, what's used in the suicide instead of what's causing these suicides. Why are we losing veterans right and left to suicide? Why are we losing active duty military right and left to suicides? Why are we losing young people? And why did the suicide numbers go up as a result of the pandemic? Was it really people being refused the opportunity for a while not to come together as social people, social animals, if you will? We really ought to be looking at those underlying reasons. And it's come up before in discussions about handguns that, and I remember when so many of the Democrats were obstructing an official session of Congress back in June of 2016. It was over their demand that we have a gun law banning some kind of guns because a radical Islamist, as he described on the recording to the Attorney General that he was doing it for Allah, he went into a club and killed a lot of innocent people. It's the same kind of reasoning that says we've got to get rid of spoons because they're making people fat, make everybody use chopsticks. This deserves the kind of seriousness where you look at what the causes are. And, we've been hearing a great deal in Congress about transgender. We even had, for the first time in the history of Congress, rules changed so that we wouldn't refer to mother, father, sister, daughter, brother. It's because they involve genders. And it brings me back to the most long-term study of transgender that was done by the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. They studied transgenders over a 30-year period. And what struck me, you're 20 times more likely to commit suicide if you're transgender and have had the surgery. And yet, we've been going whole hog into pushing people into transgender. And by that, I'm talking about like hearing a young lady in her 20s recently say she had the surgery. She began to think she was transgender when her middle school teachers were saying, if you look in the mirror and you're not comfortable with what you see, then you're transgender. And so she thought she must be. I don't know anybody in middle school that was comfortable with what they saw when they looked in the mirror. So that was greatly unfair, but we've seen the suicide rates in some of the areas we're encouraging just skyrocket. So I would rather this committee next year, under the next chairman, have some hearings to look at what is really causing the suicide. And if somebody has a gun, that's more likely to cause them to commit suicide, or is that actually not numerically an issue when you look at the number of people that have guns and those that don't, and the numbers of suicides in either? But this deserves some long-term looking rather than encouraging people to give up rights, which has already been mentioned, that opens the door to people being basically threatened into giving up their rights and making it extremely difficult for them ever to get their rights back. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Georgia seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Well, I absolutely appreciate the sentiments of our Republican colleague, Mr. Gohmert. I understand, unequivocally, yes, we do need to be dealing with all the social determinants that are creating the problem for suicide. We've not addressed those social determinants, and it is a growing problem. I understand that. But I just want to make sure that we stay on the correct path. This amendment doesn't do anything other than just allow the ability for an individual that is suffering or believes that they might be in crisis, have the ability to go ahead and place themselves on a list voluntarily. But with that, I'd like to go ahead and give the rest of my time to my respected colleague from Rhode Island, David Cicilline.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I want to just say, Mr. Gohmert, to respond to your question, there is an enormous amount of challenge to the trans community in this country, and the skyrocketing rates of suicide among LGBTQ people in America is in part because of the fact that they live in a country that doesn't fully afford them equality, and that they suffer legal discrimination in the majority of states in this country. They are subjected to horrific bullying and violence and threats of violence and isolation. And so I hope you're serious about dealing with the underlying causes of suicide. One of the ways we could, no, I'm not done yet.
Okay,
I'm happy to yield when I finish. One of the ways that we can deal with the underlying causes of suicide for members of the LGBTQ community is be sure that we work hard to make sure that members of the LGBTQ community enjoy full protection and can live lives free from discrimination of any kind. We've had the opportunity to do that. We've passed the Equality Act. We passed the Global Respect Act. We've passed a number of things out of the House with very little, I think 2 Republican people voting in support of it. So providing basic protections against discrimination, so like every other American, members of our community can live lives free from discrimination, would be a good first step if we want to try to prevent suicide among LGBTQ people. So I hope you're serious about that and look forward to your support of ours to do so. The second point I want to make is this whole notion of we have no role in helping people preserve their own lives is wrong. Every citizen in this country is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life comes first. This is a proposal that will make it easier for people to stay alive by participating, if they choose to, in a voluntary program to put a firearm out of their reach when they know it poses a threat to their life. This is not a hard thing. This is a basic responsibility of government articulated by our founders, a right of every citizen to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I don't think this is any mystery that we have no duty or no obligation we're not authorized to create a voluntary program that can help people remain alive. And with that, I'm happy to yield back to Ms. McBath and thank her for yielding the time.
I yield the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady yields back for purposes of the gentlelady from Washington,
I
D.C.
do have some unanimous consent requests. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from Laurel Stein, the Executive Vice President, Chief Policy Officer of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. The foundation strongly supports the bill. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from the American Bar Association expressing support for this legislation. Also, a statement from Dr. Matthew Miller, co-director of the Harvard Injury Control Research Center, who details the research that has been done that have led into this bill. Also, a statement from Brady, which details the alarming increase in firearm suicide rates and the ability for gun owners and mental health advocates alike to support the legislation. Also, a statement from the student that I mentioned, PhD student Jack Kappelman, as he shares the harrowing experience of his almost attempting suicide by firearm twice and how much he wants this bill to pass. Also, an opinion article from the Washington Post in which Brian Banks explains that people who are prone to suicidal thoughts and behaviors need this bill, which allows us to protect ourselves from our unwell selves. Also, a statement from Professor Frederick Vars, an incredible champion for this policy, detailing the extensive research he's done on the potential life-saving benefits of the bill, as well as his own struggle with bipolar disorder and the need for a bill like this. And finally, a statement from Dr. Joseph Simonetti, a physician and suicide prevention researcher who states that the bill is an important addition to the national toolbox for suicide prevention. And finally, a statement from Giffords Law Center in strong support of this life-saving legislation, and a statement from March for Our Lives emphasizing the outsized burden that mental health issues and suicide put on veterans and how this bill would help them.
Without objection. For our purposes, gentleman from Ohio seek recognition.
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield to the gentleman from Texas.
Thank the gentleman. And I appreciate a friend across the aisle talking about the struggles of the LGBT community. But as I mentioned, the study that I referenced from the Karolinska Institute was a Swedish study. They have very different environment in Sweden. This was not the United States. It can't be blamed on transphobes or whatever. This was done in Sweden. So that's not a good way to dismiss that particular 30-year study. But it is so important to understand that, and I have to tell people that come up here lobbying or that live in Washington lobbying, and they say, well, let's just get Congress to pass this. We go, but this is a state's right. The 10th Amendment makes clear this is not an enumerated power of the federal government, so let the states handle it. And they go, but yeah, it's just so much easier to only have to lobby in Washington and not have to go to 50 states. And that's the kind of thing that has stolen the rights of the states that the Constitution has given them in order, as my friend Mr. Bishop points out, to be the laboratory to explore different things. Do they work? And if they do, then other states can pick them up. But we are destroying the federalism simply because it is easier to lobby one place in Washington than any others. And if we allow states to do it and it looks like it actually works, then other states will want to do it. And I know there are colleagues on the other side of the aisle that understand about the spousal abuse issue. And this was brought up by a Republican a moment ago. I forget exactly whom, but as somebody here who has tried to prosecute abusive husbands and has spent time begging women not to withdraw their affidavit or say that they lied in their affidavit when you know that they didn't. You took the pictures, you saw the beating they took, but they say, no, if you try to prosecute him now, I will just say he was acting in self-defense. Some husbands get extremely abusive, and it is entirely logical that an abusive spouse would force a wife to go enroll in this program because he doesn't want her to have the opportunity to get a gun to protect herself, and that would keep her even more weak. Let's leave this to the states and see if it really works in one of those laboratories, that state. But I have immense concern as somebody that has seen how abusive husbands can be, how manipulative, and the wives come in beaten and battered, it was all my fault. Well, that would be so easy for that abusive husband to make her give up her right, her Second Amendment right, and this, we would be facilitating, helping that bully husband. I just think it's better considered to leave this to the states. And I yield back to my friend from Ohio.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the chairman. Let me thank the proponents of this legislation. And I rise to support H.R. 8361 that came through our subcommittee on crime. And it's interesting that because it has the inference of guns as one of the number one tools for suicide, it would fall in a committee that is trying to prevent crime. I want to rise to say that this is legislation that will save lives. And as I look at the numbers that are stark, that we cannot ignore, one that we cannot ignore, that suicidal behavior was only made worse at a COVID-19 pandemic. We knew there was a surge there. We know that, as I said, the weapon of choice are guns. We know that in particular, groups like veterans, Native Americans, and of course the LGBTQ community, which David has so effectively articulated, are victimized even more because of persecution, discrimination, and stigma that comes. Veterans have a 57% higher rate of suicide than non-veterans. We know that happens because we see the Veterans Association talking about that veterans are killing themselves by the dozens every single day in the United States. And being trained, they are usually using the weapon of choice, which is a gun. 2019, suicide was the second leading cause of death for American Indian and Alaska Native. Interestingly enough, suicide is now rising among children, teenagers. Tragically, families, parents are finding out the tragic loss of their loved one, and particularly their child, through the use of guns. In this instance, we're giving a lifeline to these communities and families. And in this legislation, there is a procedure to ensure that a person's name can come out of that database. I respect Judge Gomer, and obviously the protection of women from domestic violence and abuse has been one of the issues that I champion. And frankly, I face it every day in my own hometown and cities across America of the increasing scourge of domestic violence. And again, there, the weapon of choice are guns. So I realize how important it is to recognize that. I've never, however, seen any large statistics that indicate that if you can't get to the root cause of violence or the abuser, that a woman with a gun, to a certain extent, in the midst of a heated battle or circumstance, or being surprised, or house being busted in, and the abuser starts shooting, can really save themselves. I think this is something that states can work on. But this bill is worthy of being a national legislation because we have a national problem. Suicide has become a health condition, if you will, of number one proportions of the way people lose their lives. And I think this legislation will provide a safety net, again, to those who are contemplating, those who may be subjected to the thoughts of suicide, who make plans of suicide. And clearly, the veterans community is crying out for any help that they can get because their numbers are startling. Children's numbers are startling, and some of the groups that we mentioned are startling. So I ask my colleagues to consider that this is a small measure of trying to save lives. I thank the proponents of this legislation, and I ask us to look beyond some of the possible challenges to this and to look to its solutions, and ask my colleagues to support the legislation. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek recognition.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
I move to strike.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate Mr. Gomert's professional experience here. I have a very proud history as a former attorney for Westchester County of taking away guns from abusive husbands, and I very proudly support this legislation today. But I want to talk about something else. Millions of Americans struggle with depression and suicidality, yet the stigmatization of LGBTQ youth in particular places them at acutely higher risk, as you just heard from my colleague, Mr. Cicilline. LGBTQ youth are routinely subject to bullying, harassment, and violence. According to the Trevor Project, they are more than 4 times as likely to attempt suicide as their cisgender heterosexual counterparts. And each year, gun suicide is by far the most reliably fatal way for these youth experiencing mental health emergencies to take their own lives. We are losing thousands of our most vulnerable youth to gun suicide every year. Our nation's suicide prevention services need to be updated to meet the gravity of the current crisis. The legislation we are considering today is a common sense suicide prevention tactic to prevent those who struggle with suicidal ideation. Those who seek care on their own terms are often exempt from no bylaws that govern involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. Creating a voluntary federal no-buy list provides people with the agency to preemptively save their lives before times of acute crisis arise. However, this bill must not be the finish line. LGBTQ plus people experiencing mental health emergencies deserve access to a wide range of services, including the ability to prepare for the darkest moments in their struggles. They also deserve the compassion of every person on this committee. Moreover, we should not forget that LGBTQ people face an increasingly hostile environment across our nation, one that in fact undermines mental health, factors into suicides, and leads to vile acts of violence like what we saw in Colorado Springs a few weeks ago. A recent Human Rights Campaign report found that as Florida's state government enacted its discriminatory Don't Say Gay law, anti-LGBTQ misinformation surged by over 400% on social media platforms. In the span of a month, there were thousands of tweets a day peddling hate against LGBTQ plus people, especially youth, seen millions of times across the country. Worse, instead of condemning this deadly wave of misinformation and hate, members of this committee have added fuel to the fire. In October of this year, the gentleman from Louisiana, Representative Johnson, introduced his own Don't Say Gay bill in this House to apply this hateful policy on a nationwide scale. If enacted, Representative Johnson's heinous bill would, amongst other things, prohibit federally funded schools from providing sex education or library books to children under the age of 10 that include LGBTQ topics. In doing so, his bill would send a message to LGBTQ children in the most vulnerable stage of their lives that they are an other, whose very existence we refuse to recognize as a society. So make no mistake, these Don't Say Gay laws are part of a coordinated campaign by extremist politicians and their allies to attack LGBTQ kids and put their lives in danger. So while I support the Preventing Suicide Through Voluntary Firearm Purchase Delay Act and its advancement out of this committee today, Mr. Chairman, I also urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to also join me in calling out the hateful anti-LGBTQ legislation and rhetoric that contribute to suicides among LGBTQ people, especially LGBTQ youth, though not exclusively LGBTQ youth, putting an end to all forms of hate and misinformation and discrimination should never be a partisan or political issue, and I yield back. I yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Representative Scanlon.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I just wanted to return to our earlier conversation about what would be the possible constitutional nexus here, and that would be interstate commerce. So many of our firearms are sold in interstate commerce. The state that I represent, Pennsylvania, of course, borders 7 other states. So having access to a federal registry where someone can voluntarily say, you know, I don't want to buy a gun in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, New York, et cetera, has a great deal of practical use. So with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Fitzgerald seek recognition? Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin. I have a question for the authors, a very serious question. Obviously, the bill seeks to prohibit a gun dealer from selling a gun to somebody in this database, but do you also create a federal prosecution peril for family members? Is that the intent? If, for instance, I get my father a gun and he's on the list, am I now subject to federal prosecution under this bill?
No.
Would somebody on the other side answer that? I'm looking at page 7, lines 1 through 15, where you add an individual whose name is included in the voluntary purchase delay database into the list of prohibited persons. they're prohibited from receiving a firearm. And that section of the code, I believe, deals with federal prohibition on anybody. It doesn't just apply to gun dealers. If there's a private transfer between individuals, you can still be prosecuted, for instance, for selling a gun to a convicted felon or somebody that uses drugs. You can still be prosecuted for that. And since this adds somebody in this database to that list, are you telling me that that somebody could be prosecuted under federal law for giving a family member or selling a family member a firearm if they're on that list?
No.
They would not be prosecuted, even if they knew or had reason to believe, as that section of the code says, that the person they're transferring the firearm is on that list.
If you'll yield?
Yes.
If we wanted to make that a federal offense, we would have to modify that statute that you referenced for disqualified purchaser. This is a voluntary program that specifically says whoever receives a lawful from a licensed importer, licensed manufacturer, licensed dealer, or law enforcement agency for information. There's nothing in this that would criminalize a transfer from one individual to a family member. So the answer is no. I think Ms. Chappell is correct.
But it's on the section that still applies to family members, doesn't it? Like, if I know my father's a convicted felon and I sell him a gun, I can be prosecuted under the federal code that you're modifying here.
Not if you're not a licensed gun dealer.
Yeah, absolutely. You can still be prosecuted for transferring a firearm to somebody if you know or have reason to believe that they are on the prohibited
But your
list.
question is someone who puts the name voluntary on this list become a category over which transfer creates criminal liability? And I think the answer is no. That has to be done explicitly in the criminal statute.
But what I'm thinking is that Section 922D of Title 18 is just that, which is
I don't think you can bootstrap that way. I think Congress would have to explicitly add to a category of offending purchasers, people on this list.
Because there's not an explicit category in the federal law that makes it not criminal if you do this in a private transfer. I think this applies to private transfers.
No.
So you're saying if I sold it to somebody at a gun show who was on this list, I'm not breaking federal law?
Correct. Yeah, that is certainly not the intent of this provision. I don't think there is anything that would authorize that.
922D does.
Gentlemen,
So if it's not the intent, I think that authors should fix this bill. If it's not the intent to convict family members who transfer firearms or
Mr.
private
Massey,
individuals.
we're happy to fix that. I don't think that's going to bring you on the bill either, so,
But is it, I'm asking a question, does the bill do that?
So
And I'll yield to
We've said
Mr.
no.
Bishop for a
So
second.
the introductory language to subsection D is, it shall be unlawful for any person to sell or otherwise dispose of any firearm ammunition to any person knowing or having reasonable cause to believe that such person, including as a juvenile, and then so if the person ends up on the list, you've hit it.
Right.
But with the unbeknownst, we're talking about passing a bill rendering people criminals.
Right.
For doing something they have no idea.
So if my father added his name to this list 10 years ago, and he says, hey, Thomas, loan me a gun, I want to go hunting. And he seems, of sound mind to me, and I loan him a shotgun, which isn't particularly suitable for the application of committing suicide, but it has been done. And then he goes out in the woods and kills himself. Am I now guilty of a federal crime because of your bill?
No, Representative Massey, we've asked and answered it. I've told you that is not the intent. If you want to clarify that on the way to the floor, we're happy to do that.
Reclaiming my time.
We have already been
Gentlemen.
clear that that is not the intent of the bill, and we've already answered your question
I
multiple
didn't ask the
times.
intent.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Who else seeks recognition?
The intent of the bill is what this language.
What purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition? Gentlelady is recognized.
I would just say what we're marking up is not intent. We are marking up U.S. code, and it's very precise people will be convicted based on the language that comes out of here today. And so to express intent is not going to be enough. I've been in these committee markups where the other side says, no, my bill doesn't do that. And then, oh, lo and behold, they find out it does do that. And after it's passed out of the committee, they try to fix it in the Rules Committee. So, I mean, I need somebody, I want to yield time to Mr. Bishop because he's an attorney and I'm not, and to address whether he believes this creates a federal crime for family members or individuals.
I think that, well, if Ms. Fishbach will yield to me. Thank you. I thank the gentlelady. And the other side saying, or the proponents of the bill are saying that's not their intent. But that's not how the law decides what the intent of a bill is by reading its language. And the language here begins with that provision, any person, not any federally licensed firearms dealer, but any person who sells a gun under those circumstances, and then it adds this membership on this list as another prohibited characteristic. So even if they have no intention to do that whatsoever, even if that's 100% opposite of their intent, when they write it in the law that way, that is what the court says, and that is what a prosecutor exercising discretion to do would be following. That determines what the law is, not what we say here on this dais. I yield back.
With Ms. Fishbach's indulgence. So what we've discovered here is the bill does something in the language that the authors do not intend. So the question is, before this bill leaves our committee, do you intend to fix it?
We don't think that, are you asking me?
Yes.
Sorry, thank you.
If Ms. Fishbach would yield.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Fishbach. We do not believe that there is a problem. However, we will go and check it, and we will make sure before it goes to the floor that that is very clear. The transaction you're talking about does not, that does not require an X check. So it doesn't even matter in this particular case. But listen, I don't want to,
If I may speak. Okay, thank you, Ms. Fishbach. Look, the statute is clear, 922D. It's any person that transfers the firearm. It doesn't just apply to people who've undergone a NICS background check. I know that's a falsehood, this whole gun show loophole and all that other stuff. I know those are falsehoods that are stated by the other side, but the language is clear. Whether you are a dealer or not a dealer, if you sell a gun to somebody you know is a convicted felon, you've broken federal law. My question, which I think we've answered on this side of the aisle, and I hope you can figure this out on that side of the aisle, is that it does apply. You are expanding the existing statute to make it a federal crime such that a family member could be prosecuted under federal law for transferring a firearm to somebody who's on this list. And I yield back to Ms. Fishbach.
And I would yield to Mr. Bishop.
So I really would like to uncover why the proponents of the bill believe there's no problem. Here's how the language reads if you assemble it. It shall be unlawful for any person to sell or otherwise dispose of any firearm or ammunition to any person, knowing or having reasonable cause to believe that such person, including as a juvenile, is an individual whose name is included in the voluntary purchase delay database established under Section 925E. In other words, it doesn't say anything about such person being under an obligation to do a NICS check. They're not. It doesn't discharge them from liability under that language because they are, because of that circumstance. It just says if they're on that list, they have, if anybody can make a case, they have probable cause for believing that they might be, then they've committed a crime if they transfer the weapon. And so that's the language goes. How does that not have the effect of making such persons criminal?
Mr. Bishop, I've already said to you and to Mr. Massey that it's not the intent. We don't think it's a problem. However, we will fix it before it goes to the floor if there's anything to be fixed. I'm not sure what else you want us to say.
I think I'd say let's pull the bill now and let's get it fixed.
Oh, well, of course you would, but we already know that that's how you feel. So we're going to continue with the markup, and we've asked, question's been asked and answered.
Continue with a bad bill.
Time of the gentleman, the time of the gentle lady has expired. Who else seeks recognition? Ms. Massey's already spoken. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Yield my time to the gentleman from Kentucky.
I think, Mr. Bentz, here we are. We're at this point where we're doing what a committee should do, right? We're exposing it to a debate from both sides. Committees are supposed to perfect the legislation before it goes to the floor. It's not supposed to be fixed behind closed doors with later on. We know there's a problem with this bill. And I don't know why the other side is being dilatory, why they wouldn't want to fix it. They've admitted now that the bill does something they don't want it to do if the language reads such as it reads. And so I would suggest, as Mr. Bishop suggested, this is the moment in time when you either fix the bill or pull it and bring it back later after you've figured out what your bill does. And I yield back to Mr. Bentz. I think Mr. Bishop.
Yield to Mr. Bishop.
I think the gentleman from Oregon, yeah, I think, well, one thing to be emphasized is this is not merely some imperfection. You're creating a whole class of a class of criminal violations in this bill, which you say you don't intend to do, but you want to pass it out of the committee and before you've even made the necessary amendment to fix it. It ought to be simple to fix. Staff ought to be able to amend it on the fly. But I mean, my goodness, Mr. Massey's owed a debt of gratitude. He's uncovered something that I didn't.
Will the gentleman yield?
It's not my time. I'll yield back to Mr. Bentz.
Would Mr. Bentz yield?
Yes.
Thank you. I just want to observe that that side of the aisle has beaten this particular dead horse deader than a doornail. We disagree. Repeating the same argument 25 more times isn't going to change it. So why don't we just get to a vote and, or to the next amendment if there is one, et cetera. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
So, okay, maybe we've beaten the dead horse and maybe we're beating the dead horse, but quit telling us the horse is not dead. That would end the debate. And we could say the horse is dead, the bill is dead. You need to go work on it. It was well-intentioned, the language is flawed, the horse is dead. I appreciate the chairman's acknowledgement of said dead horse. But if you vote on this bill, let me tell you what you're doing. You're voting for a bill that is flawed. The other side knows it's flawed. The language is flawed. It creates criminals. Okay, if the other side doesn't know it's flawed, then they're openly committing legislative malpractice. We've read to them the language of the statute. And they're saying, let's hurry up. The chairman, I think sensing that his bill is in jeopardy, says, let's vote on the bill. Well, guess what? The bill ain't ready. The horse is dead, and I yield back to Cliff Bentz.
Well, if the gentleman, I will get on. We'll vote no, and you all can vote for the dead horse bill as Massey's described. But I do think that remember, there's a provision in the legislation that designates 5 people who are on notice that this individual who may be depressed or whatever has submitted to putting their name on the database. Those 5 people, I think, when you look at the section of the code we're amending, they are certainly on notice that this individual has done that. If they then, as in Mr. Massey's scenario, say 10 years later, we were on that notice, nothing's changed, that individual's still on the list, but he or she is fine, and they give him a gun, they were definitely on notice because they're one of the 5 who submitted to this process. So I think there's clearly a problem there. That's why we wouldn't have been beating this horse for so long, as the chairman indicated.
And the individual, by the way, doesn't have to commit suicide for this to be a federal crime for the transfer. Doesn't have to commit.
Just has a gun.
Just takes possession.
The game warden sees him out hunting in the field and says, that's a violation right there. That's a crime right there.
Yield the balance of my time.
Can you?
Does the gentleman yield back? Okay, does anyone else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to yield to the gentlelady from Washington State.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to the last comment about the 5 people. The 5 people are not notified when they are put on the list. They're only notified at the point where somebody is actually sold a gun. So that is not accurate. And I just would like to say, for all the laughs and guffaws on the other side about beating dead horses, let me just say, here's an article, Katrina Brees, my mom died by suicide. If this one thing had been different, I believe she'd still be with us. This is a law that has been passed by Republican legislators in Utah, by Democrats and Republicans in Washington State. It is a good bill that saves lives. Let's return to the issue at hand.
Will the gentlelady yield?
No, I will not.
We yield to you every time you ask.
Great, well, I'm not yielding with you because we have been trying to have a real discussion here about a serious issue, and you all just want to turn it into a big joke. It's not a joke. We are willing, I've already accepted one of Mr. Massey's amendments, which is more than I can say for most of the time that we have arguments on this committee, and we offer good amendments in good faith. They are not accepted. I thought that was a good amendment. I accepted it. We have given our intention of the bill. We do not think there is a problem with this particular issue that you've raised. Let's move on. If you don't like the bill, you can vote against it, which you all are going to do anyway, unfortunately. I hope one or two of you won't. But let's address the issue at hand. Let's not turn it into a joke. We're talking about suicides. We're talking about people who commit suicide by guns. We're talking about the fact that 50% of suicides are committed by guns. We're talking about the fact that this is lethal when people use guns. We are talking about the fact that we have a proven bipartisan piece of policy that we are considering at the federal level. It is bipartisan in its introduction. I have appreciated Representative Curtis's deep consideration of this bill and his attention to the details of it. And our states have shown that it's possible. So let's get back to the question at hand.
The
Thank
gentleman
you, Mr.
yield?
Chairman. To the chairman.
And I yield to the
sorry.
chairman, yeah.
I just want to point out one thing. I'm not going to add anything to what the gentlelady just said. I think she was quite comprehensive. I just want to point out one thing. When someone attempts suicide with a knife or any other weapon other than a gun, they're unsuccessful most of the time. When someone attempts suicide with a gun, they're almost always successful. And that is why we have to take suicide by gun very seriously, as this bill does. That's why I commend the gentlelady for introducing this bill, and I yield back.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Does anybody? For what purpose does Mr. Owen seek recognition?
I strike the last word.
The gentleman's
I
recognized.
like to yield my time to Mr. Jordan.
Well, I would just say, no one's treating this as a joke. We just want to do our job. Second, every single one of us, I think on both sides of the aisle, have said how serious mental health concerns are. I can read from my opening statement. Mental health, especially as it relates to suicide, is something that we all take very seriously. So we do. We've all said that. The metaphor was not brought up by our side. It was brought up by the chairman. Last time I checked, he's a Democrat. So we all want to take this seriously. It is not a joke. You're 100% right, but we're supposed to do our job. After all, we are legislators. That's exactly what Mr. Bishop and Mr. Massey pointed out. Yield back to the gentleman. Thank him for yielding.
Does anyone else seek recognition?
Yes, I'd like to give my time to Mr.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. So I appreciate the discussion that we've had here. I don't think anybody thinks this is a joke, and I'm going to raise one thing. If you're looking at some language that I think might need to be looked at, and that is in the ANS in section 5 under paragraph B, where it talks about the 5 individuals who could be contacted if there was an attempt to purchase. I'm not sure exactly what happens next based on this right here. So if the person does take their name, subsequently takes their name off the list, are these people notified that the person has taken their name off the list? Okay, help me, I didn't see that, and I could have just misread when I read it. But it would seem to me that you would want to make sure that that was the case, and if you can help me out, it'd be helpful. I'd be appreciative.
I do yield my time.
Would you clarify which section you're talking about?
If you look at page 3,
Yeah, so it's,
look at
it's section 5, B, so page 4, I think this is the ENS. The individual requests removal of his or her name from the database. So that's a time when they would be notified.
it doesn't,
So allows an individual.
reclaiming the time, it doesn't say that they will be specifically notified, and that's what I'm saying is I'm suggesting you might want to include that as a specific, basically a prescription, or not a prescription, but
I think it does. I'm just looking at line 20. Allows an individual described in paragraph 1 to list up to 5 electronic mail addresses to be contacted if A, the individual attempts to purchase, B, the individual requests removal of his or her name from the database.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it doesn't require it, and I would urge that you consider that making it mandatory.
It does require, it,
It says allows.
but that's allows an individual to list. So
Okay.
the allow refers to the ability to list. To be contacted if these things happen. So that is required.
I would respectfully disagree, but I'll accept that, because I know what your intention is. I'm just saying I would make it just a little bit clearer then, for people like me.
I reclaim my time. Would like to yield to Mr. Massey.
I thank the gentleman from Utah. I would suggest that we are all taking this issue seriously on this side of the aisle. That's why we are taking the language seriously. Congress has a problem. We take ourselves too seriously, and we don't take our jobs seriously. What I'm suggesting is if in the lighthearted way as much as possible without offending the other side of the aisle, which takes itself very seriously, and sometimes we take ourselves too seriously. I'm suggesting they should take the language of their bill seriously, give it the due consideration and concern that they have for the people that it will affect. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman from Utah.
Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? If no one else seeks recognition,
Have an amendment at the desk.
clerk will report the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8361, offered by Mr. Massey of Kentucky. Page 6, beginning on line 2, strike, quote, "the Attorney General," unquote, and all that follows through line 16, and insert, quote, "within 24 hours after the Attorney General receives a request from an individual to remove the name of the individual from the database, the Attorney General shall comply with the request." Quote.
All that follows through line 16. That's what he's striking. The gentleman has 5 minutes to explain it.
I think the chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I thank the chairman. This amendment is very simple, and it addresses a concern that has been surfaced already today. I think Mr. Jordan addressed the concern. That is, if somebody's name is put on this database, let's say they're in an abusive relationship and they're convinced or coerced to do that, and they're able to separate from that relationship, the other person, the antagonist, knows that the person may not be able to get the right to have a gun for 21 days. Now, page 6 here, in the original language of the bill, describes an expedited removal process, which shall not take effect later than 24 hours after the time at which a removal request is submitted. I think that's a good provision. The problem is it leaves far too much discretion to the Attorney General to come up with the process for allowing this person who wants to reestablish their right to keep and bear arms to do so. It's the text of the underlying language of the bill, the chairman's amendment in the nature of substitute, says the Attorney General shall consider input from stakeholders in development of the expedited removal process. I have a question before I proceed, and I'll yield to somebody on the other side of the aisle if they'll answer. Who are the stakeholders that the Attorney General shall consider input from, and why wouldn't we be the ones who prescribe that process instead of a vague reference to the Attorney General coming up with some rules and a vague reference to stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders? That would be my question if somebody on the other side of the aisle would. And that's on page 6, line 15. And I'll give you time, and I don't want to waste any time here.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield to Chairman.
I must say the language of the bill as currently gives two alternatives. But since it says the Attorney General shall establish procedures by which an individual may remove his or her name from the database, which shall include the following: removal upon request made to the Attorney General by the applicable individual, which shall take effect on the day, Section 2, I should say, subsection 2. An expedited removal process which will take effect not later than 24 hours. The individual has that choice already. In other words, if the individual wants his name removed in 24 hours, he has that option now. He doesn't, your amendment is simply unnecessary. He can do it now.
Reclaiming my time, the petitioner is only guaranteed that 21 days, that their concern will be addressed within 21 days. That's all the law absolutely requires. This law, the underlying bill that I seek to amend, has a reference to a 24-hour time period, but it doesn't have enough meat on the bones there, and there's no guarantee that somebody could get their firearm, their rights back in that 24-hour period. So let me describe, running out of time, and I would still yield when I'm done with this to anybody who'll tell me who the stakeholders are on page 6, line 15. But my amendment is simple. It just simplifies your language, and it says, instead of having this 21-day period and this vague 24-hour period, let's just have the 24-hour period, because the 21-day period is redundant, and let's make the 24-hour period a guarantee. And that's what my amendment does. I'll yield to Mr.
Would the gentleman
Bishop.
yield?
Let me
Maybe I can compound the question and refer both to you if we've got sufficient time remaining. If the 24-hour period is always to be respected, notwithstanding this phrase about a procedure that ensures to the greatest extent possible that the individual does not pose substantial harm to themselves or others, if that's always going to be observed and they're going to comply within 24 hours, what is the office, what is the purpose, what is the function of the 21-day period? And then I yield back to Mr. Massey to further yield.
I'll yield to anybody who would tell me who the stakeholders are on page 6, line 15.
Well, the intent of that, you yield to me? Okay.
Yes.
The intent of
Mr.
that
Paul.
is really to speak to people who are professionals in suicide prevention and to make sure that individuals are not in that crisis mode when they're requesting the removal. But it does already allow for an expedited removal process of 24 hours.
So I urge adoption of my amendment. It would just take out this vagueness. I'm not. If we wanted mental health professionals, we should say that, not stakeholders.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
I'll yield back.
I recognize myself in opposition. Does the gentleman withdraw his point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself in opposition to the amendment, and I misstated the effect of the amendment a moment ago. If you read Section 2 in its entirety, an expedited removal process which will take effect not later than 24 hours after the time at which removal request is submitted that ensures to the greatest extent possible that the individual does not pose substantial harm to themselves or others. The Attorney General shall consider input from stakeholders in the development of this process. In other words, the Attorney General has to decide that a 24-hour removal does not pose a risk, and either agree with that or disagree with that. I think that's a good safeguard.
Chairman, yield for a question.
No, one second. I think that's a good safeguard to have in the bill. And yes, I will yield for a question.
So I made an analogy earlier about thinking other situations where the federal government might request or receive a waiver of a constitutional right. I talked about Miranda, so the rights of the criminally accused, they have to be warned, and if they choose to speak, they can. But one of the other things I remember about that, I believe to be true, is if they begin speaking, and at some point in time they decide to reassert their rights and stop speaking, it has to be respected immediately. So if someone has a constitutional right to purchase a weapon, and they put themselves on this list, how can the federal government delay immediately complying with their request for
Reclaiming my
removal?
time, someone puts their name on this list because they regard themselves as a danger to themselves. They've surrendered whatever constitutional right they have to immediate restoration. They have submitted themselves to the provision of this bill.
I don't think that, I mean, we'll have to see what the case law holds at the time, but I can't
There
imagine
isn't any
that-
case law yet.
I know, that's what I'm saying, but it's hard for me to see how that complies with, I mean, once they
Mr.
change
Bishop, will
their
you
mind.
yield to, Mr. Bishop?
Wait a minute, it's my time.
It's your time, I'm sorry.
I'll yield to the gentleman. No, I'm.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to say, you are aware, of course, Mr. Bishop, you have the right to anytime you choose to voluntarily waive any of our constitutional rights. And when you participate in this program, it's a voluntary program. No one's compelled to participate in it. And so they can end their voluntary participation, but it's a voluntary program that they're allowed to participate in and not compelled to.
And reclaiming my time, given that fact, when they can
I mean,
surrender
the
their
speedy
right
trial is an example,
for-
Mr. Chairman, where someone is guaranteed the right to a speedy trial, but they can waive their right to it, and it happens
Yes.
all the time.
And as here, they can waive their right to possess a gun, and they can waive it knowing that to get it back, they may have to wait 24 days.
Chairman, yield for further on that point?
Yes.
So I don't disagree. In fact, that was the point that I made about the Miranda situation. Someone can waive their right, but the waiver stops whenever they reassert the right. In fact, I never did
Reclaiming my
speedy
time,
trial, but
the waiver stops, the person knowingly agrees that the waiver may last for as much as 24 days after he waives it, because that's the statute that he's waiving his right under.
Would the gentleman yield?
Who's asking that?
Congressman.
Yes, I'll yield.
So what does the 24-hour period that's in here hope to do? Why is it in here? Because all I seek to do is make it more clear and make that the default. Instead of 21 days, make the default 24 hours.
It can be 24 hours, subject to
Why would we want
what we were
24
discussing
hours?
a moment ago.
But why would 24 hours be necessary instead of 21 days? Because the next question
It
I
may
would
very
ask,
well be necessary if the person continues to pose a danger to himself, and that's for determination.
Or here's a hypothetical that maybe you forgot.
I'll yield to the gentlelady.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe you forgot that you were on this list, and you are not in danger of the mental health challenges that perhaps you were under when you signed up for the list, and you decide you now want to exercise your Second Amendment rights. You go to buy a gun. You find out you suddenly are reminded that you're on the list. And so you say, oh my goodness, I'm fine. I voluntarily take myself off, and you go and you make that request, and that would be one circumstance in which I could see that being necessary.
I'll yield back. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Bucky is recognized.
I thank the chairman for recognizing me, and I am a co-sponsor of this legislation, and I proudly have co-sponsored this legislation because I believe in the effort to do everything we can to minimize suicides and to protect people from themselves under certain circumstances. I have issues with this bill, and I want to state them on the record here, and I will, at the conclusion, ask the gentlelady from Washington if there is a way of trying to work on this bill before the end of this markup or in some time after this markup to address the concerns that I have. The first concern is a fairly minor concern, and it is on page 2, at the bottom of page 2, line 23, where it says, by providing necessary documentation of the identity of the individual, including government-issued photo identification in person. It doesn't say where in person is, and I'm assuming that the Attorney General's regulations would define where in person is. My next concern is on page 6, and it is the concern that I think Mr. Massey's trying to get at with this amendment in part, and that is, first of all, if you look at the subparagraph 2 of subparagraph E, it says 24 hours. I really beg anybody on this committee to tell me when the federal government has done anything in 24 hours. So I think it's a little absurd, but I do think that 21 days is reasonable. The problem I have with 21 days is when Senator Schumer was a congressman, he went into the gun laws, and there is a provision in the gun laws that allows the ATF to restore the rights, Second Amendment rights, to a nonviolent felon. So someone commits tax fraud, they're not likely to commit any kind of gun crime. The ATF makes that determination. What Congressman Schumer at the time did was to say the ATF may not use any funds to process applications for this program. Now, Senator Schumer has continued to put that rider in appropriations bills for the Department of Justice. That could be done here also. It could be very easily be inserted in the appropriations bill to say the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, may not review the applications to be taken off this list. It would have to pass Congress. It would be a concern, but it is something that I can see, and I think it's a door that may be open. I would suggest that on page 6, E, subparagraph 1, instead of received, it should be 21 days after the application is submitted. And I say that because the idea that somebody at the Department of Justice is going to receive something and date stamp that and the time starts running, I think is much more ambiguous than when somebody actually submits the document and knows that in 21 days they are off that list and can purchase a firearm. The third issue that I have is the issue that Mr. Massey raised earlier. I agree with Mr. Massey on the reading of 922, and Mr. Bishop on the reading of 922D, 18 United States Code, Section 922D, and that it opens the door for the Department of Justice to prosecute somebody who, a federal firearms licensee or anybody else who sells or gives a weapon to a family member or someone. And then I think the same issue applies to page 8, line 3 with the Brady Act. I think there is also an open door there for a violation that occurs. And so I have concerns with the bill. I also have concerns with what is happening in this country with suicide. I think Mr. Gohmert listed a number of the reasons why we have suicides and why we should be dealing with underlying causes of suicide. But I am concerned in several regards about this bill and in whether it is tight enough to really deal with this issue at this point. So I apologize to my friend from Washington for misleading her when I initially sponsored this bill, co-sponsored this bill. But I still would like to try to work on this bill, make it stronger, and bring it back. Since we have 6 days left in this, legislative days left in this Congress, perhaps next Congress, and see if we can't do something to reduce the number of suicides in this country. And with that, I yield.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
Thank you. I just want to thank the gentleman for his excellent partnership and work on this and for co-sponsoring the legislation. I don't have a problem with any of the changes that you suggested. I have always been and said to Mr. Massey earlier that I was willing to consider language that would address the issue on page 7. The other things that you mentioned, Mr. Buck, are fine. Both those changes that you suggested are fine. I think the change about the application being the date on which the application is submitted instead of received makes sense to me. And I think in terms of page 7, the question on page 8 had not come up before, but on page 7, I said that I was willing to address that before we go to the floor because my intent was very clear, and I was very happy to address that. So I appreciate your partnership, and I appreciate your you're actually reading it thoroughly and wanting to address this issue and suggesting changes that I think are very acceptable.
I wish I'd read it thoroughly earlier.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Who seeks recognition? For our purposes, hasn't Mr. Fitzgerald already been recognized on this? No, okay. Gentleman's recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. I don't even know that I'll take all my time. It just seems to me, originally when I saw the bill and now seeing Mr. Massey's amendment, that even the author referred to the successes at the state level. It just continues to appear to me that this is absolutely the type of thing that could be better handled by your state legislature. When you think of the diagnosis of somebody that has serious mental health issues, so significant that they would actually go to the list of professionals that you have, and that varies from state to state as well, right? You could be talking about a school psychiatrist. You could be talking about a middle school or a high school counselor where somebody goes in there and admits this. And then beyond that, clinical social workers and psychologists, all licensed by the states. And then we kind of come in here with the federal footprint and say, okay, this is how we're going to fix all of this. So my problem now is, and I think this is what Mr. Massey's amendment does, it once again kind of demonstrates that this could move very quickly to be put in place where somebody could find themselves on this federal list. But then to unwind it later on and go back through this system, and including an attorney general, I think there would be a hesitancy by each and every one of these individuals that may originally have been counseled to say, time out. We just had somebody that admitted they are suicidal and have some serious mental problems, and what you're telling me is you want me to declare this person fine. I don't see it. I don't see that happening anytime quick, especially with the list of individuals that are right in the statute. So, I'm not saying that, it isn't a laudable goal. It probably should be. You yourself, the author said that there were states that were having good successes with this, and maybe that's because they could tailor-make it to their own situation and the mental health care professionals and the systems that evolve organically in each state. We shouldn't come in here with the heavy hand of the federal government and say, we can do this better. It's a mistake. It was said right away, this is a 10th Amendment type of situation by, I think, Congressman Gomer. We should allow this to move from state to state. If, in fact, it's successful, that's what the state legislatures should feed on. So I think that you're forcing something today. Mr. Chairman, you're forcing a vote today, too. I mean, it's not just about the author. The committee has a stake in this. We want to make sure that we continue to move good legislation forward to the Rules Committee, to the floor that makes sense. So this is as much your call, Mr. Chairman, as it is anyone else's. And it just doesn't seem like it's ready for prime time today.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
And I thank the gentleman for speaking on my amendment. I want to speak to a point he made. If somebody went to the effort of getting a doctor's recommendation to put themselves on this list, what is the threshold to get off the list in 24 hours? It seems almost unovercomable. Because the Attorney General, by the way, not some state health person, but the U.S. Attorney General, right, has to ensure to the greatest extent possible that the individual does not pose substantial harm to themselves or others. They've gone to great extent to prove that they do, to get on this list. How would they ever reach this threshold to get off the list? And I think there are times when they need to get off the list in less than 21 days. If there's a harm to them, like really that's what should be considered in Section 2 if it's going to be conditional on anything. Does the person themselves have fear of their lives? And it should be a consideration such as that, but I think the threshold is so high that this section, even though it's E section 2, subparagraph 2, it's important, but it's dead on arrival, and so my amendment seeks to make it actually an active section and just say, within 24 hours, the individual's name can be removed. And I yield back.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I would just say it seems somewhat ham-handed. It's not ready, and I would hope that the committee would not advance it today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? For what purposes Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
So I've actually read this bill multiple times, and there's some problems, I think, in the language of the bill. But I just ask myself a few questions. It seems to me that we are recognizing in here that someone is voluntarily waiving their constitutional right to purchase a firearm. I thought that was kind of agreed, everybody agreed to that. And then to get off the list, they're going to have to provide some demonstration that they've stabilized or you know, their mental condition is stabilized. Well, so we had a little discussion over here. I won't blame anybody else. But it seems to me if you're going on voluntarily, do you have the capacity to go on and waive your rights? If this were under the Miranda, for instance, which Mr. Bishop was talking about, that would be there would be infirmity in whatever right they gave up after having heard Miranda rights because they couldn't construe them. And I guess that's the question I'm struggling with now, having gone through this bill multiple times, is are we imputing onto somebody who actually just provides their name and their identification under Section 2A1, or if they do the alternative, they've got a letter from a mental health professional saying that doesn't say what they have to say. The point is they get on there, they're waiving the right, but to get off, they're going to have to demonstrate some kind of different mental capacity than to get on. Seems to me like you might have a question as to the validity as the initial waiver, because I'm not sure that they had the cognitive capacity to actually waive. And that would be a problem, which is why, oddly enough, there are federal laws that cover people who don't have the capacity to waive, and they're already in place. And there are state laws that do the same, so this bill seems kind of somewhat infirm and superfluous to me. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Seeing no one seeking recognition, the question occurs on the Massey Amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay.
No.
The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I would request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler? No. Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen?
There will be a lot of
Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Ms. Bass?
Bass votes nay. No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demmings? Ms. Demmings votes no. Mr. Correa?
No. Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
A voluntary no.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Isa?
Aye.
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey?
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes yes. Ms. Fishbach? Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye.
Madam Clerk, Congressman Johnson, how am I recorded?
Mr. Johnson, you are not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Shabbat, you are not recorded. Mr. Shabbat votes aye.
Has anyone wish to vote who has not recorded their vote?
Congressman Cohen would like to vote. What are we voting on?
Mr. Cohen, this is the Massey Amendment. The Massey Amendment. The chairman voted no.
No.
Thank you.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
I vote no.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Chairman, this is Congresswoman Ross. How am I recorded?
Ms. Ross, you are not recorded.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Mr. Johnson, you are not recorded. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes yes.
Ms. Jackson Lee, has she been recorded? Yes, okay. Has anyone who seeks to vote not been recorded? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 15 ayes and 20 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? The question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. This will be followed immediately by vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of Chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill, H.R. 8361, as amended, favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. A recorded vote has been requested by several members, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren?
Yes.
Ms. Lofgren votes yes. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
How did the chair vote?
Actually,
This
Mr.
is final
Nadler,
passage.
you can recall Mr. Nadler, please.
Mr. Nadler? Aye. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Ms. Bass?
Bass votes aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal?
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demmings? Ms. Demmings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Tiffany?
Tiffany, no.
Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach? Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no.
Ms. Jackson Lee?
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye.
Mr. Cohen would like to vote aye.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Are there any other members who would like to be recorded who have not been recorded? The clerk will report. Has Mr. Johnson of Louisiana been recorded?
No. Mr. Johnson, Louisiana votes no. Mhm. 2016.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 20 ayes and 16 noes.
As I said previously, the ayes have it, and the bill as amended is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H-Res 1477, calling for the submission to the House of Representatives of certain information in the possession of the Attorney General regarding NICS indices self-submission forms for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the resolution without recommendation to the House. The clerk will report the resolution.
H-Res 1477, calling for the submission to the House of Representatives of certain information in the possession of the Attorney General regarding NICS indices self-submission forms.
Without objection, the resolution is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'll begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement on behalf of the chairman. H-Res 1477, introduced by Representative Andrew Clyde, is a resolution of inquiry requesting that the Attorney General provide complete and unredacted copies of any documents, records, reports, memos, correspondence, or other communication generated or received by the Attorney General that refers to NICS indices self-submission forms, including how the determination to distribute the forms was made and the reasoning for distributing the forms from January 1, 2016 through the present date. This request pertains to an FBI form that allows an individual to voluntarily relinquish their right to own a firearm based on their lack of mental capacity. It has been said that the submission of this form results in the individual's entry into the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS, as a prohibited person who is federally barred from possessing a firearm. Without more information before this committee regarding these forms, it's difficult to take a position on the resolution. There may be legitimate reasons to look into this issue. However, it's worth noting that this committee has had several hearings and markups on firearms-related issues, and the minority has not raised a single issue or asked any questions about NICS self-submission forms. Moreover, the resolution requests records that date back to 3 different presidential administrations with 4 different attorneys general, suggesting that time is not of the essence here. My colleagues across the aisle can easily request this information directly from the Department of Justice Office of Legislative Affairs rather than through a formal resolution of inquiry. And of course, the 118th Congress is just a few short weeks away when they will have the majority in the House. Because I believe that a resolution of inquiry is not the best vehicle for obtaining this information, particularly in the waning days of this Congress, I urge the committee to report the resolution with no recommendation. I now recognize Mr. Bishop on behalf of the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's interesting this arises immediately after the bill we just finished because they are connected in a way. Mr. Chairman, between 2016 and 2019, the FBI created and utilized what they called a NICS indices self-submission form. As the name of the form suggests, the form allowed people to self-submit to NICS. By signing this form, these people relinquished their right to purchase or possess a firearm and authorized the disclosure of personal health information to the FBI. According to documents received through FOIA requests, the FBI utilized these self-submission forms on at least 15 occasions. On these occasions, armed FBI agents presented these forms to individuals, which raises the concern that the forms may have been signed under duress. Legitimate questions exist about whether these forms were signed under duress, thereby depriving individuals of their Second Amendment rights without due process. While use of the forms has been allegedly discontinued, it raises serious concerns that the FBI would undertake such actions to deprive Americans of their Second Amendment rights without congressional authorization or due process. I applaud our colleague, Congressman Clyde, for pursuing this serious issue. Republicans are committed to holding the FBI accountable for its conduct when we assume the majority in 4 weeks. I yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to HRS 1477, offered by Mr. Nadler of New York. Strike all after the resolving clause and insert the following: that Attorney General Merrick Garland is requested to furnish to the House of Representatives not later than 14 days.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will now recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment in the nature of a substitute makes a single technical change to the resolution of inquiry by identifying Attorney General Merrick Garland by name. No other changes were made to the resolution. I urge all members to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
I agree with Mr. Bishop on this. This is very timely. And I hope the other side of the aisle will read one of these NICS indices self-submission form. It's actually a form you fill out if, and I'm going to read it to you, if you have a mental health condition that may cause you, check all that apply, to 1, be in danger of myself or others, 2, lack mental capacity adequately to contract or manage the details of my life. And then the second part of the form involves verification of physician or mental health professional. What we're looking at is evidence that the FBI went ahead and wrote some laws and implemented.
The gentleman will suspend.
I'll suspend.
The committee is not in order. The gentleman deserves to be heard. You may proceed.
Appreciate the chairman. What we're looking at is evidence that the FBI went off on their own and wrote the bill and implemented the bill that you all are trying to pass here today, or did pass, and will try to pass on the floor. It's exactly what you're trying to do. But the problem is, that's the executive branch. They don't have this authority. This inquiry would hopefully lead us to understand why they think they're the legislative branch. And also, maybe it would help us understand what sort of implementing language they think we gave them that enabled them to create this form that allows somebody to submit themselves to the NICS database because they believe they're a danger to themselves or others. Precisely what you were trying to legislate, they have done without you. And so I hope the other side of the aisle, for no other reason than intellectual legislative curiosity, would join us in requesting this information from the executive branch, the administrative branch, the branch of government which has no authority to do this. And it also, surrounding our inquiry, are the issues that we raised in the debate on the previous bill, which is, were they coerced? Was somebody pressured? Did the FBI say, you know, we're thinking about investigating you, or we're thinking about prosecuting you, but if you fill out this form, it'll all be good? Or did somebody say, I've got a program here, I've got some inducement, some disability benefit that I would love for you to receive, but I just don't think you're mentally capable, you don't manage your own finances. If you just kindly fill out this form and give up your God-given right to defend yourself, we'll get you that money. We need to know how these, first of all, what led the FBI to believe they have this power. Clearly, this whole committee is I believe is unanimous here in agreeing that they don't have this power. And also, how did they wield this power, and what was their intent when they did? Because if the bill that just passed this committee that's going to go to the floor gets implemented, I'd like to know how they're going to implement it. They've already done it once without us. So let's find out. And I'll yield to Mr. Bishop.
Yield.
Yes.
Maybe they did it because they didn't think the Congress could express in clear language what the Congress intended to do.
Well, it is clear. The implementation is clear here. It's not clear, though, how you ever got your name off this list once you got on this list. And if the FBI once believed they had the power to do this, they must certainly believe they still have the power to do this. And they clearly do not, or we wouldn't have been debating and amending that bill for over an hour in our committee just now. So I urge adoption of this resolution of inquiry. And I want to thank Representative Andrew Clyde from Georgia for offering it. I did not know this issue existed it really kind of blows my mind to see that the FBI went forward and created this on their own out of whole cloth with no legislative underpinning, and it deserves to be checked, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? All right, a recording quorum being... That's what I'm about to do. The question occurs then on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote reporting the resolution. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to.
I request a recorded vote.
No,
Okay,
next
I'm
thing.
sorry, A&S.
A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the resolution H-Res 1477 as amended without recommendation to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The resolution is ordered reported without recommendation.
Mr. Chairman, at this point, I would like to request...
I have very good hearing. I'm
good.
certain I heard that. A recording vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Ms. Bass.
Bass votes aye.
Ms. Bass
Right.
votes aye. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stimmings. Ms. Stimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa.
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia. Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath. Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson, Louisiana. Mr. Johnson, Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Tiffany.
Tiffany, no.
Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Spartz. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no.
Mr. Shabbat?
Mr. Shabbat votes no.
Mr. Nadler?
Mr. Nadler votes yes.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote?
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes yes.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 21 ayes and 14 noes.
The ayes have it. The resolution as amended is ordered, reported without recommendation to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the resolution will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes.
Pursuant to notice, I now call up HRES 1478, calling for the submission to the House of Representatives certain information regarding the decision of the President of the United States to institute the ghost gun rule for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the resolution without recommendation to the House. The clerk will report the resolution.
HRS 1478, calling for the submission to the House of Representatives of certain information regarding the decision of the President of the United States to institute the ghost gun rule.
Without objection, the resolution is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'll begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. Ghost guns are firearms constructed with component parts that can be obtained anonymously without a background check and which lack serial numbers. Most ghost guns are assembled from parts or kits. These kits, available at in-person stores and online, contain all the parts needed to assemble a firearm, including unfinished receivers, tools, and step-by-step instructions. Since ghost guns are devoid of serial numbers and other identifying marks, they're not traceable by law enforcement, making them the perfect weapon for would-be criminals. Ghost guns have been linked nationwide to homicides, suicides, mass shootings, robberies, shooting deaths of law enforcement officers, and domestic violence. From January 2016 through December 2021, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives received reports of more than 45,000 ghost guns recovered from crime scenes, including nearly 700 from homicide investigations. Without the ability to trace these guns, far too many crimes go unsolved, and the people who committed them remain free to harm our communities again. In May 2021, ATF announced that it would seek to update firearms regulations to address the proliferation of ghost guns, an essential measure to protect public safety. On April 11, 2022, Attorney General Garland signed the final rule, which mandates serialization and background checks for certain gun kits and requires the serialization of some existing ghost guns. HRES 1478, a resolution of inquiry introduced by Representative Andrew Clyde, calls for the submission to the House of Representatives of certain information regarding the decision of the President of the United States to institute the ghost gun rule. The resolution requests the President to furnish to the House not later than 14 days after its adoption a copy of any documents, records, reports, memos, correspondence, or other communication, either generated or received by the Office of the President, that refers to or relates to the decision of or the reasoning used by the President to institute the ATF ghost gun rule. This resolution of inquiry comes in at the very end of the 117th Congress and well after the ghost gun rule was finalized. It's also directed to the President rather than to the Attorney General, who might be the more appropriate party for this request. I would note that the Ranking Member Jordan sent a letter to the ATF on November 3rd, just over a month ago, seeking various information from the ATF. In part, this letter follows up on a letter sent by Mr. Biggs in August of last year, which requested information about the ATF's proposed ghost gun rule after it was announced, but well before it was finalized. Ranking Member Jordan's recent letter acknowledges that the ATF responded to the 2021 letter, but now states, 16 months after that first inquiry, that the response was insufficient. ATF should be given time to respond to this revived inquiry, and indeed they've already committed to responding. If they do not respond, Ranking Member Jordan has said he intends to follow up in the 118th Congress. Given this recent request and ATF's commitment to respond, this resolution is unnecessary. Accordingly, I urge the committee to report the resolution with no recommendation. I would also urge the committee and all of our colleagues to be serious about the threat that ghost guns pose to our communities. It's certainly number one on the to-do list for all of the law enforcement, federal, state, and local, that we talk to regularly in my district. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. Actually, I recognize Mr. Bishop for his opening statement.
I thank you, Madam Chairman, and on behalf of the ranking member, Mr. Massey was just pointing out in the case of the FBI and the NICS indices self-submission form that the FBI essentially implemented a law that hadn't been passed until today. It's been passed through this markup. Well, in this case, we have the ATF with the so-called ghost gun rule is a clear example of another federal agency far exceeding its authority in law. The rule goes well beyond the authority granted to the agency in any federal statute. The rule unlawfully expands the definition of a, quote, firearm to include, quote, a weapon parts kit. However, when passing the Gun Control Act in 1968, Congress provided a specific definition for a firearm, and it did not include weapon parts kits. In other words, the ATF took it upon itself to redefine and expand the meaning of firearm, even though Congress had explicitly chosen to define the term with precision in the statute. In addition, the ATF rule inserted a new definition of, quote, frame or receiver, using language from the Federal Firearms Act of 1938, a law that Congress repealed when it passed the Gun Control Act of 1968. By doing so, ATF completely disregarded Congress's express intent in that repeal. The rule also requires federal firearms licensees to retain firearm transaction records indefinitely, despite current regulations that allow an FFL to destroy these records after 20 years. According to ATF data, even data of the ATF, the statistical average time to crime following a firearm purchase is about 7 years. Requiring FFLs to keep firearm transaction records indefinitely doesn't strike the right balance here on the burden to FFLs and the need to stop crime. During the 90-day comment period on this rule, ATF received over 290,000 comments. We understand that this was the largest number of comments on a rule in the Justice Department history. Almost all of the public comments were in opposition to the ATF's rule, but the Biden administration finalized it anyway. Committee Republicans have now sent 3 separate letters to ATF requesting information about this rule, and to date have received only a half-page response. This is unacceptable. We need answers, and we will get them. I commend Mr. Clyde for championing this issue, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to HRS 14.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment in the nature of a substitute makes a single technical change to the resolution of inquiry by identifying President Biden by name. No other changes were made to the resolution. I urge all members to support the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If no one seeks recognition, for what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Like the last word.
Use your mic. Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Statistics show that much of the recent so-called crime wave involves firearms, which have been a pervasive problem in America long before the COVID-19 era. The average year, guns account for roughly 2/3 of homicides. However, in 2020, 77% of murders involved firearms. Today, more people are carrying guns in America, legally and illegally, than ever. More guns lead to more shootings. In my state, it's a holiday for gun shootings because of the open carry, permitless open carry bill, no waiting periods, absolutely nothing. to stop juveniles, persons coming from North Texas to kill in El Paso, or to kill neighbors, young man killing in Uvalde. It is absurd. And now law enforcement must also contend with untraceable ghost guns, which are perfect for committing crimes like the gun an assailant made with a 3D printer and then used to shoot 3 Houston police officers in January of this year, while I watched in my congressional district a regular shootout with the criminal, the perpetrator, shooting at police, running through the streets, and the police running after them, and they using a ghost gun. Oh, how absurd this is. I visited those police officers in the hospital. Their recovery was not overnight. It was weeks and months. Their families had to deal with these injuries. Ghost guns are unserialized and untraceable firearms that can be brought online and assembled at home, and rather than by a federally licensed manufacturer and importer of firearms. Absolutely disgraceful. These weapons are often marketed as ghost gun kits, which include all the parts and equipment necessary to build these weapons at home. These kits are widely available and can be purchased. The rule issued by ATF was a result of a year-long serious work. Additionally, ATF officials should be allowed to respond to the inquiry that has already been addressed, and I urge the committee to report the resolution with no recommendation, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who else seeks recognition? In that case, the question occurs on the amendment nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on reporting the resolution. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have, the amendment nature of a substitute is agreed to. Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the resolution HRES 1478 as amended without recommendation to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the resolution is ordered reported without recommendation to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the resolution will be reported as a single amendment in nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Okay. Committee will suspend for a moment. The committee will stand in a brief recess until further notice.